Ezra Pound, Readings and Recollections. First, here is D.G. Bridson to tell us of his visit to Ezra Pound.
In 1958, Ezra Pound returned to the Italy where he'd already lived for more than 20 years. The recordings you're about to hear were made at the castle of Brennenburg near Murano, where Pound now lives with his daughter, Princess Mary de Rakowice. Pound is now in his 70s, but remains as forthright and trenchant as ever. The 13 years that he spent at St. Elizabeth's Hospital have left very little outward effect on him, though he tires fairly easily in the mountain air. His study at the castle is high up in the central tower, with a magnificent view of the mountain peaks that rise about the head of the valley. The room is packed with his books and papers, Chinese calligraphy well to the fore, and Gaudier Brigesca's well-known black and white profile of him propped up against the wall above his desk. There we spent some 3 or 4 afternoons, with Pound stretched out on his bed, talking and reading from his poetry. Down below in the garden, facing the west, where the first gleam of the sunrise catches the snow-covered mountain tops, was Gaudier's famous feet-high bust of him, for which the profile had been a preliminary sketch.
Gaudier made about 100 of those heads, not with any known instrument. It was a little flat, pliable stick. He did about 100 of them, and I think most of them got torn up before he did the big marble head.
The part which Ezra Pound played in securing recognition for Gaudier's work is well known.
Gaudier was the most absolute case of genius I've ever run into, and they killed off an awful lot of sculpture when they shot him. You've got to consider that all this sculpture was made during 3 years. If Sophie Suzanne hadn't got him out of France, smuggled him over to England, he'd have been doing his military service, the preparation for military service, and he never would have done anything. Then he went back and was killed at Neuville-Saint-Vaast, which is the kind of wastage you get in a war.
I talked with Pound about his early days in Paris and the recent exhibition American Expatriates of the 20s.
Well, the 20s didn't start anything. Good God, I saw Paris for the first time in 1898. And I was wandering around Paris in 1906 with a Celt Breton named Maturindando, who was telling me about Paris at a time when Bert Hessler was cursing Mr. Dondo, who was a mild-mannered man. "You dirty Frenchman coming over here to corrupt our country." Well, Dondo was then doing most romantic stuff in the style of de Musset, and I don't think he published a book until about 2 years ago, and then he came out and published one of the few books of contemporary French verse I can read with pleasure. Flint, you see, thinks he told me all about Paris or French poetry. Well, good God, I think it was 1906 that Catulle Mondet's widow had dumped all his library that she couldn't sell. It had been dumped onto the quays there at 5 cents a volume. I mean, Auguste Soilou and Thibaudet de Memille and so on, dedicated to Catulle Mondet's aux gloires et décors de la langue françoise, Catulle Mondet's and so on. And one started to try to weed this stuff out.
Pound came to England in 1910, but his early years in London were anything but prosperous. He told me about his early digs.
In Islington, I saw 12 and 6 a week bed and board, but after 3 days, I don't know what the deuce they did to the food there, I compounded for bed and breakfast. And then Langham Street, and then I went out to Hammersmith for 3 and 6. It was fairly small quarters. There was a slide, and you put your suitcase out on a shelf over the hall, but the threepenny bus fare cut off anything in the nature of economy. Then I found Kensington Graveyard.
12 and 6 a week, or in those days $2.50. Bed and breakfast for 60 cents. It wouldn't go far in London today. Most of the lesser poets that Pound knew in pre-war London are now forgotten. He remembered some of them among his earlier friends.
Well, I'd like to see an anthology for lost poets in England who did 1 or 2 good poems. Well, there was Grace Reese, who wrote as well as her husband, and Hewlett, Sutton Picard, Fred Manning, There was Margaret Sackville, who was my despair when I first got to England. Of course, it was Swinburnian to some extent, but she started off a poem, "The night forgets the day, and there is no rumour left in any place of twilight." And there was Joe Bromley. And somebody was going to do a book on Kensington. Well, if they do the people who were in Kensington instead of hunting around for inferior inédits, that would be a blessing.
Pound has done more than most people to secure recognition for the work of those in whom he believes, but he pretends to see it otherwise.
It might be amusing to know that no established publisher has ever accepted a book on my recommendation since Elkin Matthews took old William Michael Rossetti's translation of the Convito. It is true there was a near escape. There was a guy who did a book on Melville, and I was so glad to see a short book that saved me the trouble of reading Melville that I recommended it to the Reverend Eliot. He thought that might be done, you see, and he recommended it to a firm in New York, and they printed it on his recommendation, and then he decided it needn't be done in England, so that was a narrow escape. The author was annoyed because he thought I'd made an enemy for him because a fellow named Matheson had turned it down and they overrode him. And there was another near escape when I'd been plaguing a friend of mine to reprint Dr. Williams' In the American Grain, which is about the best thing he ever did. Well, Mr. Laughlin, he wouldn't touch it on my recommendation, but finally my wife told him to do it, and he did it. Those are the two narrowest escapes, but otherwise my record with established publishers is absolutely clean and zero. Maybe if instead of giving free advice I insisted on getting a $2,000 fee for it, maybe they would take it seriously.
One of the earliest influences in Pound's own poetry, of course, was the work of Robert Browning.
I learned from Browning, and I'm still learning from Dante. Now, that doesn't mean that Browning has been exhausted. The whole of the novel in England after Browning is indebted to Browning. And then again, there is a whole lot of Browning that's never been built on, stuff like the In album and so on. Young people don't see the magnificent amount of work that's lying around, ready to do, and that hasn't been done. They think there's nothing left to write.
The Browning influence can still be found in Homage to Sextus Propertius, poetry in which the first echo of the cantos can also be heard. Here is the reading that Pound made for me of two of the poems from the sequence.
When and whenever death closes our eyelids, moving naked over Acheron, upon the one raft, victor and conquered together, Marius and Jugurtha together, one tangle of shadows. Caesar plots against India. Tigris and Euphrates shall from now on flow at his bidding. Tibet shall be full of Roman policemen. The Parthians shall get used to our statuary and acquire a Roman religion. One raft on the veiled flood of Acheron, Marius and Jugurtha together. Nor at my funeral either will there be any long trail bearing ancestral lares and images, no trumpets filled with my emptiness, nor shall it be on an italic bed, and the perfumed cloths shall be absent, a small plebeian procession, enough and in plenty. There will be 3 books at my obsequies, which I take my not unworthy gift to Persephone. You will follow the bare scarified breast, nor will you be weary of calling my name, nor too weary to place the last kiss on my lips when the Syrian onyx is broken. He who is now vacant dust, was once the slave of one passion. Give that much inscription, death, why tardily come? You sometimes will lament a lost friend, for it is a custom, this care of past men, since Adonis was gored in Idalia, and the Cytherean ran crying with outspread hair. In vain you call back the shade, in vain, Cynthia, vain call to unanswering shadow. Small talk comes from small bones.
And here is Pound's reading of the 8th poem from Homage to Sextus Propertius.
Jove be merciful to that unfortunate woman, or an ornamental death will be held to your debit. The time is come, the air heaves in torridity, the dry earth pants against the canicular heat. But this heat is not the root of the matter. She did not respect all the gods. Such derelictions have destroyed other young ladies aforetime, and what they swore in the cupboard, wind and wave scattered away. Was Venus exacerbated by the existence of a comparable equal? Is the ornamental goddess full of envy? Have you contempted Juno's Pelasgian temples? Have you denied Pallas good eyes? Or is it my tongue that wrongs you with perpetual ascription of graces? There comes, it seems, and at any rate through perils so many and of a vexed life, the gentler hour of an ultimate day. Io mooed the first years with averted head, and now drinks Nile water like a god. Ino in her young days fled pell-mell out of Thebes. Andromeda was offered to a sea serpent and respectably married to Perseus. Callisto, disguised as a bear, wandered through the Arcadian prairies, while a black veil was over her stars. What if your fates are accelerated, your quiet hour put forward? You may find interment pleasing. You will say that you succumbed to a danger identical, charmingly identical with Semele's, and believe it. And she also will believe it, being expert from experience. And amid all the gloried and storied beauties of Maeonia, there shall be none in a better seat, not one denying your prestige. Now you may bear fate's stroke unperturbed, or Jove, harsh as he is, may turn aside your ultimate day. Oh, lecher, let not Juno get wind of the matter, or perhaps Juno herself will go under if this young lady is taken. There will be in any case a stir on Olympus.
I was interested in the very distinctive style which Pound brings to his poetry reading. Apart from the rolling of the Scots R, I seem to find in it also an echo of W.B. Yeats.
My reading style, I believe, has altered a little since we used to meet at that horrible place called the Tour Eiffel, with Stulich's protruding stomach and bulbous nose to enhance the favour of the food, but Hume discovered the place and Wyndham had credit there. And I read the Bloody Sestina one night, and a week later Stulich comes around with a screen, puts it around the table and says, "Now, gentlemen, you can make all the noise that you like." I mean, I believe what Ford called my Northumbrian was more emotional at that period. I suppose one is more emotional at 20, whatever it was. And Yeats's reading, well, in the first place, he had Florence Farr, who really could read, and then Yeats, his means of seeing his rhythm was pulling out the vowels, made a great peacock in the pride of his eye, that kind of thing. I don't know where he got to later. I think my reading now shows more interest in the meaning of what I got on the page. I know when we were down in Syracuse, out in the Greek theater there, and he wanted me to read something. I suppose he wanted me to read something of his or recite something. And I found that the only thing one could do in the open like that, the only thing I could remember that you could speak clear enough to get across was Sappho's Poikilothron, with whatever Greek pronunciation or mispronunciation I use of it. But I have no idea how he read after 1920.
The literary London of Pound's earlier years was largely dominated by Bernard Shaw, but for neither Shaw nor the Fabians had Pound very much to say. His own beliefs were very different.
Now, when it comes to education, there are two things that everybody ought to hear about at the age of 16 and think about when they get to the college or university. And one of them is the issue of money, and the other is the tax system. Now, socialism has always appeared to me to be idiocy, and the MSI, that's a label they got on a party here, had a paper, and they printed a statement to that effect. Of course, whenever I put in a plug for free speech, I get accused of endorsing the whole program of whoever permits it. Well, about socialism, what you had in England, you had the stuffed Webbs and you had the pusillanimous Mr. Shaw. Now, about the Webbs, even the adoring Margaret Postgate, remember Beatrice saying, now we've found out what to do with the infants and the aged and the infirm and the feeble-minded, and what are we going to do with the able-bodied men? And as for Mr. Shaw, that old character wrote me about Ulysses, that he just couldn't stand reading it and that no book was worth 3 guineas. As a matter of values, of course, and the kind of thing that those bloody Fabians put up with in your country and put over Mr. Shaw's Aid to Culture, one-cylinder civilization based on abstract ideas.
The Ulysses to which Pound refers, of course, was the Ulysses of James Joyce. It is a book with which Pound's name is always associated, and I asked him how he came to be concerned with the work.
Well, it started when I did the first anthology des Imagistes or Imagists, which are to be carefully distinguished from the Imagists, who took the one vital component, namely to use no useless word, out of their little manifesto and program. When I was doing that, I asked Yeats if there was anybody in Ireland fit to put into that volume. And he said there was this buzzard off in Trieste, so I wrote to Joyce and put that I Hear an Army into that collection. Then Dubliners had been sabotaged in Ireland, and Dubliners finally got printed, I forget how. Then we serialized the portrait in The Egoist. And then when the little review came on, I don't think the Egoist get the Ulysses printed in England, and we started serializing it in America. And after I think the little review was suppressed first for Wyndham Lewis's Cantleman's Spring Mate. But after it had been finally suppressed 3 or 4 times for Ulysses, and Quinn had thought he was being clever to get the case before an intelligent judge who would keep postponing it until they could finish printing it, the damn judge says to Mr. Quinn, I suppose you'd like to get this thing through as quickly as possible. So that the little review was finally stopped in America, and there'd been all this succès de scandale and so on, and all that publicity had led to, they'd heard about it in Paris. That's all I know about that publication.
Pound has always insisted upon the fact that the best and most useful criticism generally comes from creative writers.
I believe that the best critics are the men who do the job. They sometimes make an intelligent remark before, but they're more likely to do it afterwards. And they've got out an edition of Whitman now with a few bits of prose in it. He didn't spend his time writing essays, but he was the best critic of American literature in his time. And this collected volume has got an interview with Emerson, or at least Whitman's memory of his interview with Emerson, which is a crackerjack. And the same way with Hemingway. I mean, he didn't spend his time writing flat-chested, highbrow essays, but he had sense enough to see that Ulysses was the end and not a beginning. I mean, the two halves, those who regard Ulysses as the end of a period, and then the Zavora, the decadence from it. Well, I mean, Hem's attitude toward some of these people, I remember a gentleman who has since had a certain amount of publicity, and Hem looked at it, you see, and he says, "Can't you see the son of a bitch in 10 years' time sitting in an office turning some good guy down?"
Well, we've probably already lived to see that happen. As it was, Pound himself remained a very salutary and critical influence on his time, and nobody has assessed his own part in those early years more objectively than he did, in the well-known self-portrait which he included in Hugh Selwyn Moberly. The literary London of those days, in fact, was one that we now associate with Pound's own particular group of friends, with the Egoist and with the Little Review.
Well, as Rodker said, with the Little Review, the group at any rate exceeded that of any other group by 4. It was started so you could have a place where Joyce and Wyndham Lewis and Eliot and I could appear together. And after they'd squashed it in America as a monthly, it had to go on. It went to Paris. There wasn't anything new at that level. We'd had Yeats and Lady Gregory and Ford and Symonds. We'd had as much of the good elder middle-aged stuff as we could get, so we had to fall back on the arts, and we ran a Brancusi number. It's the first time he'd let anybody print photographs of his stuff. And then we did a Picabia number.
Pound left London and followed the Little Review to Paris, and it was there that Francis Picabia, the painter, became one of his friends.
Francis Picabia was dangerous to be with. I mean, you had to watch your step or you'd fall over it. When I was picking the stuff, he'd moved out of the country studio into a bourgeois flat out by the Porte Maillot, and he'd got his paintings hung up on the wall. Oh, yes, that was a thing when I went down to the country to paint and tried to think that I liked it. Well, I said, we'll take that one and that one and that one. No, not that one. No, not that one. That's a Picasso.
On the subject of Picasso himself, Pound also had something to add.
Picasso would go on for a year making a new style and passing it off to the dealers. He's a great financial genius, whatever he is as an artist. Of course, he and Lewis are the two people who'd been through the mill. They'd done all the academic stuff. They weren't merely doing abstract art because they couldn't do something else. But Picasso would have a new style or something, and at the end of the year, Picabia would pick up a pencil and do 5 or 6 squirrels on a bit of paper. Yes, here, this is what Picasso's been handing him for the last 6 months.
The Paris of the 20s was a stimulating place to be, even for a man like Pound. Apart from the painters, there were the other writers, Joyce in the last stages of writing Ulysses, and a new generation of Frenchmen.
Well, when I went to Paris after the war, I went over to see what was going on, and I was in Paris for 6 weeks, and nobody mentioned Cocteau, and I did 3 essays. I forget where they came out, at any rate on the island of Paris. Then at the last minute somebody mentioned Cocteau, so that my note on Cocteau was a separate thing that came out as a postscript. I mean, the men I knew were Léger and Brancusi and Cocteau and Picabia. And there seemed to be a great deal of envy of Cocteau and a lot of sloppy snobism. And you had this Nouvelle Revue Française, which is certainly the midwife of France's decay as far as their mind or their literature is concerned.
We get an amusingly pre-academy picture of Cocteau in those early days.
Cocteau disciplining the snobism, and all these people who never got anywhere sitting around filled with envy of Cocteau. Cocteau running a nightclub, you see, and saying, of course, you make them comfortable, they won't come. You've got to take a place like this that looks like a lavatory, and then they'll pack into it. And you'd see Mr. Swallow and Mr. de Memille, etc., sitting around at a table at the door, and Cocteau playing a drum in a jazz band, and not with any African fervor, but as if it were a very difficult mathematical operation that had to be thought out.
The 20s were a period of transition. You may remember how Pound quoted Hemingway on the subject of Ulysses, an end rather than a beginning. Pound summed up the period for me, at least so far as major prose writing went, in these terms.
After Ulysses, the novel was in a crisis, and there are these 3 outsized books that are all masterpieces. There is Ulysses, and Cummings' A Me, and then finally Wyndham comes along with his Apes of God. And one wondered why Wyndham was bothering with it, and then 10 years later you see that he's analyzing a very dangerous disease which has done no end of harm in England. After Ulysses, Bird's Press in 3 Mountains issued a series called The Inquest, which was an attempt to see what there was in English prose that would serve as a basis to go on from. And in that, you have got Your Humble Servant, or Your Unhumble Servant, and Old Doc Williams, and Ford's Women and Men, a book by Windler, one by B.M.G. Adams, and Hemingway's First Prose. And that is about where I would stand on that period. And after the age of 50, a man cannot be a telephone directory of contemporary writers. If he's going to do his work, he's got to start in and do it. He can't keep his eyes on the ends of the earth or on all the sprouting corn.
Such, then, was the story of Pound's earlier years and contacts as he remembered them in our conversations at Murano. From then on, first in Paris and later in Italy, he was to settle down to the writing of his cantos, the major work on which he has been engaged for the last 40 years. We shall be hearing his views on that work in the second of these recorded conversations.
Ezra Pound, Readings and Recollections. First, here is D.G. Bridson.
In the first of these recorded conversations with Ezra Pound, we left him at the point where he began to devote himself to the writing of his major work, the cantos. In many ways, Ezra Pound is the cantos. No work of its time has been more hotly debated, praised, attacked, enjoyed, deplored, imitated, and avoided. As the start of a poem is the most obvious place to begin with any reading of it, Pound recorded the opening of the poem for me.
And then went down to the ship, set keel to breakers, forth on the godly sea. And we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also heavy with weeping. So winds from sternward bore us out onward with bellying canvas, Circe's this craft, the trim-coifed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail we went over sea till day's end, sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean. Came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands and peopled cities covered with close-webbed mist, unpierced ever with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven. Swartest night stretched over wretched men there, and the ocean flowing backward. Came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Here did they write Perimedes and Eurylochus, and drawing sword from my hip I dug the L-square pitkin. Poured we libations unto each the dead, first mead and then sweet wine, water mixed with white flour. Then prayed I many a prayer to the sickly death's heads, as set in Ithaca, sterile bulls of the best for sacrifice, heaping the pyre with goods, a sheep to Tiresias only, black and a bell sheep.
dark blood flowed in the fosse, souls out of Erebus, cadaverous dead of brides, of youths, and of the old who had borne much, souls stained with recent tears, girls tender, men many mauled with bronze lance heads, battle spoil bearing yet dreary arms. These many crowded about me, with shouting, pallor upon me, cried to my men for more beasts, slaughtered the herds, sheep slain of bronze, poured ointment, cried to the gods, to Pluto the strong, and praised to Proserpine. Unsheathed the narrow sword, I sat to keep off the impetuous, impotent dead till I should hear Tiresias. But first Elpenor came, our friend Elpenor, unburied, cast on the wide earth, limbs that we left in the house of Circe, unwept, unwrapped in sepulchre, since toils urged other. Pitiful spirit! And I cried in hurried speech, Elpenor, how art thou come to this dark coast? Camest thou afoot, outstripping seamen? And he in heavy speech, ill fate and abundant wine, I slept in Circe's ingle. Going down the long ladder unguarded, I fell against the buttress, shattered the nape nerve, the soul sought avernus. But thou, O king, I bid remember me, unwept, unburied, heap up my arms, betombed by seaboard and inscribed, a man of no fortune and with a name to come, and set my oar up that I swung mid fellows. And Anticlea came, whom I beat off, and then Tiresias Theban, holding his golden wand, knew me and spoke first. A second time, why, man of ill star, facing the sunless dead in this joyless region, stand from the force, leave me my bloody bever, for sooth say. And I stepped back, and he, strong with the blood, said then, Odysseus shalt return through spiteful Neptune over dark seas, lose all companions. Then Anticlea came, thy quiet Divus, that is Andreas Divus in Officina Vecli 1538 out of Homer, and he sailed by Sirens and thence outward and away and unto Circe, venerandam in the Cretans' phrase, with the golden crown Aphrodite, Cyprium monumenta sortita est, mirthful, oricalci, with golden girdles and breast bands, thou with dark eyelids, bearing the golden bow of Argicida, so that...
One of the carps usually levelled at the cantos, of course, is that the Chinese history and American history sections make pretty heavy reading for most people. But whatever one makes of Pound's obsession with Adams, Benton, and the other American figures that bulk so large in the later cantos, there can be no doubt as to the magnificent poetry which he has made out of his attack on usury.
All right then, Canto 45. With Usura hath no man a house of good stone, each block cut smooth and well-fitting, that design might cover their face. With Usura hath no man a painted paradise on his church wall, harpes eluth, or where virgin receiveth message, and halo projects from incision. With Usura seeth no man Gonzaga, his heirs and his concubines. No picture is made to endure nor to live with, but it is made to sell and sell quickly. With Usura sin against nature, is thy bread evermore of stale rags? Is thy bread dry as paper, with no mountain wheat, no strong flour? With Uzora the line grows thick. With Uzora is no clear demarcation, and no man can find site for his dwelling. Stone cutter is kept from his stone, weaver is kept from his loom. With Uzora, wool comes not to market. Sheep bringeth no gain with Uzora. Uzora is a murrain. Uzora blunteth the needle in the maid's hand, and stoppeth the spinner's cunning. Pietro Lombardo came not by Uzora. Duccio came not by Uzora, nor Pier della Francesca. Juan Bellin not by Uzora, nor was La Calunnia painted. Came not by Uzora Angelico, came not Ambrogio Predis. Came no church of cut stone, signed Adamo may fake it. Not by Uzora Sant Trophim, not by Uzora Sant Hilaire. Uzora rusteth the chisel, it rusteth the craft and the craftsman, it gnaweth the thread in the loom. None learneth to weave gold in her pattern. Azure hath a canker by Uzora, cramacy is unbroidered. Emerald findeth no memling. Uzora slayeth the child in the womb, it stayeth the young man's courting. It hath brought palsy to bed, lieth between the young bride and her bridegroom, contra natura. They have brought whores for Lucis, corpses are set to banquet at behest of Uzora.
Pound's attitude to life and living really adds up to the better part of the cantos. In a very simple form, his attitude towards writing can be summed up in the statement that he made to me.
You can't have literature without curiosity. You cannot have literature without curiosity. And when a writer's curiosity dies out, he is finished. He can do all the tricks you like, but without curiosity, you get no literature with any life in it.
Curiosity is something that Pound possesses in full measure. Pound's interest in Chinese dates back to his years in London during the First World War. To begin with, his interest was mainly confined to a study of the Chinese ideogram as a means to the writing of poetry. In fact, his interest probably stemmed from his own particular experiments with imagism. But a work which Pound read in manuscript was to have a profound influence over his whole approach to the subject. It was Ernest Fenollosa's essay, The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry. I asked Pound how he happened to come across the manuscript.
I went down and read Giles' history, and I wasn't content with the translations, and I wanted to know how I could get some more Chinese, and I knew that if he knew any, he'd keep it to himself. And within a few weeks, I was at Sarojini Naidu's and met Mrs. Fenollosa. And Fenollosa had been scrapping with the academic fatheads, and he'd left his manuscript with her, and she'd sat on it. She hadn't turned it over to anybody. Here she was, the lightest possible, apparently frivolous society woman. And after a couple of weeks, I got a note, would I come down to that hotel in Trafalgar Square? Is it Morley's? At any rate, it's where my grandfather stayed. And here she was, gone like a priestess at an altar, and she merely said, you're the only person who can finish this stuff the way Ernest wanted it done. And then she sent me his manuscript. That's the whole story.
Partly as a result of his reading Fenollosa, Pound began to try his hand at translating Chinese poetry. The result was the brilliant series of Chinese lyrics published under the title Cathay, one of Pound's most popular works. He was to return to the same vein many times in the next 40 years, as for instance with these two odes from the songs of Tsi.
He waited me by our gate screen, come by, his earplugs have shone so florally, come by, on white silk tassels airily, come by. He came straight into our courtyard, come by. His earplugs flamed so fiery, come by, on silken thread like greenery, come by. He stopped not till he reached the hall, come by. The yellow tassels airily held two topaz right royally, come by.
Ode number 105, La Madone de Wagon-Lits.
On comes her car with a rattle-de-bang, woven leather like cinnabar, loose, a flaming star, ye dest, mist's eye shooting the moon to loo, started at sunset, none too soon. With a black flash of quadrigas and the multitude of her chariots, double teams matched, smooth-oiled reins, Loo road stretching across the plain. Full be the waters of Wen as we hear the whang of marching men. Mist's eye and Loo road we see, both wider than all liberality. Across Wen water churning mud, a herd of travellers in flood, and loose on Loo road a mist's eye, showing compassion abundantly.
Pound's interest in Chinese literature was not confined to poetry for long. Soon he was equally interested in Chinese thought and philosophy, particularly in the works of Confucius. He has made equally successful translations of the Confucian Analects, the Ta Sio, or Great Digest, and the Chung Yung, or Unwobbling Pivot. I asked him why he found Confucianism so important to his own thinking.
Well, you can't shorten up on Kung himself. Take the fourth verse at the start. The men of old wanting to clarify and diffuse throughout the empire that light which comes from looking straight into the heart and then acting, first set up good government in their own states. Wanting good government in their states, they first established order in their own families. Wanting order in the home, they first disciplined themselves. Desiring self-discipline, they rectified their own hearts. And wanting to rectify their hearts, they sought precise verbal definitions of their inarticulate thoughts, the tones given off by the heart. Wishing to attain precise verbal definitions, they set to extend their knowledge to the utmost. This completion of knowledge is rooted in sorting things into organic categories.
I asked Pound how he felt that Confucianism differed from Christianity, and his reply amused me.
Well, I made a definition early in life, and I found that I could always get a favorable response from the Afro-American colleagues in misfortune at the Bug House. In contrast to Confucianism, doesn't Christianity boil itself down to one commandment, namely, thou shalt attend to thy neighbor's business before thou attendest to thine own?
Confucian thought, of course, is reflected in the Shi King, the Chinese classical anthology which Confucius himself is said to have edited. Here is Pound's own reading of two of the shorter odes from that collection, in his own translation.
Epithalium 57, it rhymes with Sidney's sister. Tall girl with a profile, broidery neath a simple dress brought from Tsai, her loveliness to wise marquisate. Younger sister of Tung Kung, palace of the east, crown prince. One sister of hers is the darling of the great lord of Hing. The other's man, Tan's viscount is. Hand soft as a blade of grass, her skin like cream, neck like the glowworm's light, her teeth as melon seeds, a forehead neat as is a katydid's, her brows and lids as when you see her smile or her eyes turn, she dimpling the while, clear white against black iris. Tall she came through the tilled fields to the town, her quadriga orderly that 4 high stallions drew, with scarlet tasselled bits and pheasant tails in woven paravant. Thus to the court, great officers retire, and let our noble lord assuage his fire. Ho tumbles north, tumultuous, animate, forking the hills. Sturgeon and gamey trout swim and leap out to spat of nets and flap of flat fish tails, with Kiang's dames high hairdos flashing bright above the cortege armed might. I think that's the one where you must, in the original, go back and use the supposed pronunciation of the period. There's the onomatopoeia of the put of the fishtails on the key. Of course, there's a lot of onomatopoeia in the original, and you need both the ideograms for the interweaving, and you need the graph of the sound to see what one is trying to get at in the translations. Clang, clang go the bells, turgid of the Huai, clashing of waters, till sorrow has torn the mind, and the lords of old time go not out of heart. Gong over gong, cold waters driven, till the heart is riven for the clear deeds of the lords of old, flawless. Bells, drums, over the 3 isles of Huai, till the heart is moved that we see not their like who were here before us. Cha-in, cha-in of the bells, 2 lutes, organ and stone, in even tone, so shall the elegantiae, so shall the south be sung, nor flutes shall mar.
Pound's interest in the poetry of the classical anthology extends to the ideas contained in it, for facts and ideas have provided him with the subject matter of almost all his recent work. But he is not particularly interested in acquiring facts for their own sake, unless the facts are important.
These idiotic universities, all full of gadgets, and provide the young men with no tools. Now, a tool is useful for a lot of different things. All the science of physics comes up out of a few simple tools like the wedge and the screw and the lever, and they keep on using them over and over. A gadget is no use except for some particular job, and very often only in connection with some artificial complicated contraption. You've got a series of books which teach young men something they've got to find out or else they'll be diddled. Then you've got 100 books at St. John's, none of them there to teach the kids anything in particular.
This idea of a minimal course of reading, a list of the basic books, is one of Pound's favourite subjects.
The medieval Putnam's books and their makers in the Middle Ages points out that the medieval university, the students had about 6 books, and they had to stick at them until they knew something about them. Back in the 20s, I tried to get Eliot and Santayana to line up on the idea of a curriculum, and Santayana at least brought out it don't matter what they read so long as they all read the same thing. And that same thing ought to be a body of common knowledge required for any fathead who gets a job running a government, and it ought to be required either for college entrance or the first year in college, and as a qualification for suffrage.
For the record, Pound would concentrate on the following 6 key books as a start. The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry by Ernest Fenollosa. The Confucian Analects, The Unwobbling Pivot, and The Great Digest. Gists from Agassiz. The Bank of the United States by Thomas Hart Benton. The History of Monetary Crimes and Roman and Moslem Moneys by Alexander Del Mar. Now, I won't go into the reasons behind this rather eccentric choice. I'll only say that if the books are responsible for the peculiar quality of Pound's own work, they're well worth everybody's attention. The place of taxation in a proper economy is one of the matters on which Pound feels very strongly.
Well, there are only about two subjects that I got the strength to argue about. One is how you issue money. Plenty of people want to know how you get it, and there isn't one in 100,000 who will take the trouble to find out how it gets there in the first place. And the other question is the system of taxes. Everybody groaning from Naples up to Aberdeen about the amount of the taxes, and nobody will ask how do they issue them and how you levy the taxes. Want you to spend half as much or twice as much to get the stuff out of the poor sufferers as comes in from it. And the basis, I should think, of a tax system ought to be justice. And Mencius pointed out that it ought to be a percentage of the product, not a fixed charge, regardless of whether the poor bastard has got it there to give you or not. They talk about soaking the rich. Well, you don't soak the rich, you soak the lazy rich. The clever rich will always hire 24 lawyers to see how they can get out of it. Now, shall we start with cheapness in collection? No, I wouldn't. I'd start with justice, the justice of the tax. Now, as from Mencius, that is a percentage of the product, not a fixed charge. And for the second thing that you'd want, it would be the minimum cost of collection. Thirdly, the convenience of collection. Let us say a manner of collecting that does not permit dodging. Fourthly, it ought to encourage production and not sabotage it. And damn it, now your taxes penalize practically every useful activity a man can think of. And fifthly, it should not create crimes. That is to say, it should not turn simple mercantile utility into a contravention of statute. As the bootlegger, he was known as the Ripper down at the DTC. He said he'd been a bootlegger. He said it was whiskey, but it may have been red wine. But I said, now, would you be a bootlegger if there was no tax? Of course he wouldn't be a bootlegger. Well, your present tax system penalizes. It penalizes useful activity. It makes a crime of taking diamonds from one place to another, and you have a whole police force to chase the people who do it. And that is the kind of thing that you ought to avoid.
Pound's position as a champion of monetary reform and other matters is well known. But what does he consider himself to be, and how would he describe himself as a writer? I asked him as our conversations drew to a close.
Well, if I got to have a label, I suppose I'm a syndicalist, simply in the sense that I think plumbers ought to have a vote about plumbing, and literate men ought to have some say about literature. Of course, in Byzantium they had trade organization. It was a little bit bossed from the top, but it can also be democratically organized with the division of powers and so on.
Our last evening together at Murano was nearly over. I took a last look around Pound's study with its Gaudiers, its Chinese calligraphy and its Martinellis. Pound put on his sombrero and his long yellow scarf with its embroidered Chinese ideogram, "Make it new," and we walked down the spiral staircase from his study to the castle garden. I counted, incidentally, 84 steps. There, lit up by the sunset, was the towering Gaudier bust of Pound, staring up at the mountains. We went in from the garden for our evening drink with Pound's son-in-law, Prince Boris de Rakevil's. On his return to Italy, when he went to live at Murano with Boris and his daughter Mary, Pound met his two little grandchildren for the first time. And one of the most amusing memories I have of my stay at the Castle Brunenberg is that of Ezra Pound reading a bedtime story to his grandchildren, one of the adventures of Brer Rabbit. As with everything else he does, Pound brought to it an immense gusto, a wealth of humanity, and a king-size sense of humour. I like to think that from now on life for Ezra Pound will be comfortably lived in that quiet and happier setting, and that he has indeed found port after more than unusually stormy seas. For in such pleasant surroundings the long voyage of the Cantos themselves may find a fitting close, even as that other Ulysses once returned to